Hello again. I really just wanted to check in very briefly about the first chapter in the Methods Matter text by Murnane and Willett. I am a big fan of this book. As I mentioned in my introduction video last week, this book does get a little bit sophisticated pretty quickly. So if you're really into it and really getting excited about it, absolutely read it. There's some great kind of pulling apart of articles and some really good examples of different methods in different articles, but it goes well beyond what we're going to talk about in the class kind of writ large. So just very quickly, I wanted to talk about chapter 1, which is part of the assigned reading for this week, which I think does a really good job of very concisely giving a little bit of history of why we're even talking about this and why education research matters, as well as what that means moving forward. So I don't want to spend a whole ton of time talking about the history piece of this in particular. This will probably be a very short little clip anyway. But I do want to pull out some points that I think are just really salient from that very short first chapter. So the first, because everybody in this cohort works at a public institution. I work at a state agency. So I think something that's really important that they kind of say quickly in this book is that you have to be able to show what you're getting for your investment. So when we get an appropriation each year from the General Assembly, the money that comes through the budget, that comes through the formula, sometimes there will be questions about what is actually happening with that money. And I think a really good example of that is the Tennessee Promise program. So that program is about 4 years old, and legislators and the governor's office and people on campuses and just people in the general higher education world are asking questions about where is this money going and what is the actual result and how are students being affected. And I think for a long time, like the authors talk about, those questions weren't really being asked. And when they were being asked, there were not great ways to address them. It was kind of fluffy, right? Like education research was a little bit fluffy back in the day. So I think a really important frame, not the only frame by any means, but a really important frame for those of us working in the public sector needs to be, we need to be able to show where the money is going and what the effects are. There's a really kind of famous, example of that, but counter example of like what you should do around Head Start. For a really, really long time, the federal Head Start program, the universal pre-K program for low-income students, or not universal, but the pre-K program for low-income students, there was just never any evidence, good or bad, about what the program was doing. People who were studying the program didn't really do so in a sophisticated way, if at all. So eventually there were changes to the program and to the funding structures because there was no evidence that was demonstrable of what the program is doing. Now, Head Start does wonderful things for these students and their families to get young children ready for kindergarten and whatever else. But I just think that's a really good kind of case of this is why it's important to make sure that you're showing what these programs are actually doing. So for a long time it was kind of fluffy. I think something that some folks get a little bit bent out of shape about, but I think some folks in education get bent out of shape about, but I think it's just a reality that education research is kind of implicitly multidisciplinary, and they talk about that a little bit more in the book about how there are many people who are actually specialists in they're economists, right? Their specialty is economics, political science, sociology, many different fields study education. And for some folks, they study it as well as studying other things, but some folks specialize within education. If you're like me, I am not any of those things. I am an education researcher. And I think some people kind of in my bubble, in my world, get upset that there are other people who are in other fields who study education almost as an application. I don't think that is a worthy thing to get upset about. I say all that to say some of the rigor and some of the improvement to higher education is as a result, higher education research and education research more broadly, there are some K-12 examples in this chapter, have to do with sort of borrowing from these other social science disciplines and really doing things the way that they had been doing them in those fields for years and applying them to education. So even though I am none of those things, I am an education researcher, I was trained in some methods related to sociology, political science, and particularly economics. So that just really speaks to the need to do this rigorous education research for the purposes of kind of proving where the money's going to some extent and what impact programs are having on students. But you need to maybe do that most often with methods from other fields. So that was pretty much all I wanted to say about that. There was a really interesting kind of history laid out about the Coleman Report and the work of Eric Henishek, who used to be at the University of Rochester. I believe he's still at Stanford, who was kind of a pioneer in this field. So that's it. Those are the highlights. And like I said, this book gets really good, but it gets really wonky. So feel free to read as much or as little of it as kind of fulfills your desire around this. But the crux of this first chapter is really just being able to demonstrate what is the effect of whatever program you're working on or whatever funds you're getting on schools, on students, on universities, on community colleges, etc. So happy to talk more about this when we are in person at Vol State in a couple weeks, but I think it's important just to kind of think about the why, right? Have a great day. See you all soon in person. Can't wait.